Hi everyone, welcome to this week's lecture, which is all about exploratory factor analysis. That word may seem intimidating and scary, but hopefully by the end of the lecture it seems much more approachable and understandable and less scary. So that's the goal, and you'll walk away being more knowledgeable about what exploratory factor analysis is and maybe more appreciative of why it works the way it works and why it's important. But before we get into that, let's talk about what we discussed in the last lecture, which was really all about covariation. And we started off really with an understanding of variance and the spread of data points around, say, our mean, for example, and quantifying that and looking at the relationship between variance and standard deviation, understanding that the square root of the variance is the standard deviation and the relationship between the two. And then we talked about covariation and how as one variable changes, the other variable changes, and so they co-vary. And that was important because it really is the foundation of our understanding of relationships between variables. But we emphasized that there was a limitation in some ways with this because for the variables to use covariation, they need to be on the same scale. And it also meant that you can't actually compare the covariation between two measures on the same scale here and two measures on the same but different scale over here. So what you need to do to sort of be able to bring all of that together is have a standardized measure of the relationship between variables. And this is where we came into our understanding of correlation. So correlation is that standardized measure allowing us to look in standardized units and measure the effect sizes. So we can say the effect size between these two measures is 0.4, and the effect size between these two measures is 0.6, and then we can actually compare the effect size between them and say this has a larger effect than this. So that was all about covariation, the purpose of correlation. We talked a lot about linear correlations and the types of correlations, and that included a reference to our understanding of levels of measurements and the types of correlations we use when it's nominal, binomial, when we talk about chi-squared statistics, as well as using Spearman's rho for when it's ordinal by ordinal, and then for interval by interval is Pearson's correlation. And then also we use the point by serial correlation for when it's a categorical variable by the continuous interval variable. So that was all of the sort of summaries of the correlations, and we talked about situations where you can merge one into another if you change the level of measurement going down the scale. That's the only way measures can change. So we talked all about the types of correlations and interpreting correlations and the importance of how you can interpret correlations in different ways, and particularly when you had the point by serial correlation and how the coding of that categorical variable really matters. And then we talked a lot about assumptions and limitations. What I want to emphasize when it comes to assumptions in particular is that we're going to talk about assumptions of exploratory factor analysis today. And I want you to recognize a lot of the similarities that are there, because exploratory factor analysis is built upon correlations. And so these are not separate topics. The assumptions that apply to allowing us to run a correlation analysis are really a lot of the similar assumptions that we use for knowing whether we can go ahead and run an exploratory factor analysis. So if you're struggling with correlations or you don't fully grasp some of the concepts, I'd really encourage you to go back to the lecture, revisit some of the concepts, and make sure you have a good understanding of them before progressing, so that you can fully integrate that knowledge into our understanding of exploratory factor analysis. And we, of course, talked about the limitations that arise with correlations. In addition to the understanding about correlations, it doesn't imply causation, but also being aware that if there are two factors that are causally related, they're likely to be correlated as well. So we need to understand the experimental design context, confounding factors, and that will build as we progress through this course in terms of understanding causality. Excellent. So that was everything to do with correlation and what we covered in the last lecture. So today's lecture is all going to be about an introduction to factor analysis, getting you familiar with that terminology of what is a factor analysis, I will go through an example exploratory factor analysis that I've created. That's the steps and process to conducting a factor analysis, and then use that example to sort of showcase some of those steps. And then the assumptions to be aware of in order to be able to run a statistical test like this. So what is factor analysis? So this is a good question. So well done in asking it. Factor analysis, it's a tool we can use to identify the structure of a set of items. And so again, coming back to the terminology of statistics, what do items mean? Those are questions on a survey. You can think of those items as questions on that survey. And with each of those items, the important thing to remember is that those items are what we're using in our analyses, right? So to get a sense of the structure of these items, we can use factor analysis to get a sense of that. So the variance of many variables might be explained by a smaller number of underlying clusters or factors, with each factor representing several related variables. What does this mean? Well, you have a survey. It has, say, a questionnaire that talks about personality, and it has 12 items there that focus on personality. Well, the idea of what a factor is that many of these items will cluster on individual factors. If you know much about personality, you'll know that there are things like openness, agreeableness, conscientiousness. There may be many questions that measure our understanding of conscientiousness or extroversion. And so these clusters are what we call factors. So the factor consists of many items that are interrelated. So again, interrelated correlations, that's the link there. So factor analysis uses correlations amongst many variables or items. I'm going to use these words interchangeably because the items could be variables, variables could be items, to sort related variables into clusters called factors. So that's the terminology. So you have survey items, which could be variables, they cluster together onto related factors. We're going to go over this in multiple ways, in different ways. I think repetition is really, really important, particularly with new difficult concepts. So don't worry if it's not all clicking yet. We're going to show different examples and emphasize what is factor analysis in these different ways. But why do we use this sort of factor analysis? We have a survey. What does it matter for why we should be using something like factor analysis? Well, it could be something in relation to theory development. So perhaps you want to examine the hypothetical structure of relations between constructs, or identify factors and classify variables. Or it could be used for data reduction. So you reduce variables down to a smaller number of factors, leading to the calculation of a composite score of each factor. And then the composite scores can be used in subsequent analyses. So you may observe, and this could be done in all sorts of ways, but an example is in genetics literature. You have all these sort of variables. There may be genes that contribute to, say, genes that contribute to well-being, and you may not know what genes contribute to what, or if they're related to one another, and so you can actually break that down and to identify what are the specific genes that cluster onto a particular component or factor. And this is where then you can create a composite score from here with the genes that are there based on what is it? Is it A, T, C, G? That's a more biological example, but there's other examples that we'll look at which are more in personality based and socially based, which are focusing on factor analysis. And in those survey-based examples, that's where you can use the composite scores and as well, where you add up all of the items that contribute to a factor, and then you can get a total score for what that person's score is on extroversion or introversion or whatnot. So data reduction is a really it's really the powerful way in which you can use factor analysis to make sense of really complicated data. And that's why I use genetics as an example, because you have so many genes and you're trying to understand how they sort of map on to different behaviors or different traits. And so factor analysis can even be used here for data reduction, but also theory development is another function for understanding the hypothetical relations of structures between constructs. So for theory development, so we can test theoretical models by investigating the underlying correlational patterns. So you have a look at what the relationship are between factors and items and get a sense of what the constructs may be that are there. And so we can address theoretical questions such as how many personality factors are there and what are they? Is intelligence a general capacity or are there multiple dimensions of intelligence? And so this is where factor analysis is really useful because you may have something like a IQ test, and you may think that this is a test of general intelligence, but then maybe you look at each of the individual items and you see actually they cluster on certain facets of intelligence. And so that's where factor analysis can be so useful in terms of understanding where do individual parts of a survey or test or genome, how do they cluster together and they're interrelated to one another. So that's factor analysis for theory development. So an example is how many dimensions of personality are there? And what are the dimensions of personality? So using factor analysis, it can actually help you decide between 3 or 5 factor personality models. You may have heard of Eisenach's 3, which includes extroversion, neuroticism, and psychoticism. And then there's also the big 5, which is openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And so factor analysis really allows you to pull out the types of factors that may be there. Now, an important thing, as with all of science, is that there's a lot of justification here for selecting your factors and your factor structures and making that interpretation as to what structure is best. And so it may be that one researcher goes into a problem and identifies a 5-factor structure as best. Another goes into the same problem and identifies a 3-factor structure that's best. And really, it's about the justification that they use to see which structure is best in that utility. And so here's an example of it in personality. And so is intelligence best described as a global factor, or are there several specific factors? So back to this example, you may look at an IQ test, and then when you look at the individual items, you see actually these ones cluster on questions relating to verbal intelligence, and these ones cluster on items relating to spatial navigation. And here are ones that are really mathematically focused. And here's one that really measures social intelligence. And so these sort of clusters of items are your factors, right? So when you have that clustering that's occurring there. So factor analysis can help decide which model best describes the data. And that's on the underlying function of factor analysis. It allows you to have a framework for understanding, well, what model allows us to make sense of the data that's here. So some more examples just to really hammer home the point of what factor analysis is and how it can be utilized. So depression scales, they may have a cluster of items measuring different symptoms. So there could be cognitive symptoms or somatic symptoms or emotional symptoms. These could be the clusters of items within a survey. So think of a survey of depression. It has say 12 or 15 questions. It may be that some of those questions measure the cognitive side of depression versus the emotional side versus the somatic. Well-being, so factor analysis can pick out different types. For example, feeling good, which is hedonic well-being, versus feeling life is meaningful, which is eudaimonic well-being. And also emotions. So experience of positive emotions cluster together, as do negative emotions. So these are more examples of how factor analysis can work. If that wasn't enough, here are some more examples. So there's social support, can be separated into 3 examples: support by family, friends, and romantic partners. Sexism, there's hostile and benevolent sexism. And then social dominance orientation, 1 factor assessing preference for dominance, and 1 on a preference for inequality. So those are all examples of how factor analysis can be used to make sense of data and constructs that are there. So hopefully that gives you lots of examples, a good sense of how factor analysis can be used and in what ways in real world research. Another component is that data reduction element. So in psychometric instrument development, factor analysis is used to simplify the data structure by identifying a smaller number of underlying factors. So factor analysis then helps to identify items for improving or removal because they are, for example, redundant. So if you're administering a survey and you have a question that asks someone how happy they are, and then you have another question that also asks how happy they are, and those two questions are, I mean, they're not said exactly that way. It could be something like, I typically in the last week feel happy more often than not. And then another question which says, I often feel happy today, right? And one measures in a week, one measures in a day, but perhaps they're highly correlated to one another. And you may do your factor analysis and realize actually the correlation between these two items or variables is so high that they're essentially measuring the same thing. I don't know if there's much nuance between the day and the week. And so then you may decide to remove one or the other. You can also use factor analysis to identify unclear or irrelevant items, or variables. So what I mean by this is when you do your factor analysis, you say you have 12 questions, you have 3 key factors, and you notice that 10 of the items or variables or questions load onto the 3 factors nicely. So first 3 load onto the first factor, second 3 load onto the second factor, and then the next 4 load onto the third factor. You have these 2 that are sort of weirdly floating around. And then you look at those items in more detail, those questions, and you realize actually they don't seem to be really measuring what I thought they were measuring. And so you could actually remove them if they have low loading on the factors. And we'll come back to this terminology later. So factor analysis also informs the calculation of factor scores. So what I mean by this is you have the items that can cluster onto a specific construct, and then you can create a score to measure that construct. So composite scores combine our respondent scores for several related items. Why is that useful? Because in our examples previously, if we do something like, say, emotions, and you have positive emotions clustered together, negative emotions clustered together, and they each have 7 items, you can then, say, add up those 7 items, their score on the Likert scale, divide it by the 7, and then you have an average score of positive emotions for that scale, or average score of negative emotions for that scale. So it can be really useful to give you a composite measure of something. And this is why it can be used in so many different contexts, because people are very interested in finding ways to measure complicated constructs. So that is that. I think I'm going backwards, which is why I'm confused. So I went through these examples and we talked about the composite scores. So factor analysis helps eliminate redundant items. So items which are highly correlated, unclear variables, items which don't load cleanly onto a single factor, and irrelevant variables, so variables which have low loadings on all factors. So I've written that twice, not because I wrote it once and thought I forgot about it and wrote it again on the same slide later on. It's because it's so important. It is really important. That is really the focus of factor analysis, and I did forget. I didn't realize I'd written it twice, so apologies for that. But it is important to know that's why factor analysis is useful. In addition to data reduction, it helps you understand the meaning of the variables that you have there. So what's the history of factor analysis? Well, it was invented by Pearson, a man you'll hear a lot in statistics, and Spearman as well, another man you'll hear a lot of statistics. So initially Pearson invented it in 1901, and then it was refined by Spearman a few years later. Now, early factor analysis involved hand calculation, and we'll be doing it in this course. We won't do any hand calculations. Sorry, I don't know why I decided to raise anxiety and stress that way. I just thought it was funny, but maybe not so funny. There's computers now, so there's no need to do it by hand, even though it can be done. But it showcases why factor analysis is so widely used, particularly after the 80s. It's because computers were available to be able to be used to conduct this type of analysis. Similarly to, we referenced Bayesian analyses in the first lecture. This is something that is actually quite computationally taxing or intensive. And so nowadays it's very, very common to do and use, but many years ago it was actually quite difficult to do this sort of analyses without computers. So the advent of computers and computational power and efficiency has been amazing at allowing us to analyze data, and the better and better computers get, the more we're able to analyze more and more complex sets of data as a function of that. So I think you can see that with AI, but here's just an example where it's used in statistics as well. So there are two types of factor analysis. These include exploratory factor analysis, which explores and summarizes underlying correlational structure of a data set. And then we have confirmatory factor analysis. So this tests the correlational structure of a data set against a hypothesized structure and rates the goodness of fit. So in exploratory factor analysis, theoretically, you don't really have a sense of what you're expecting. So you summarize the underlying correlational structure of the data set and get a sense of, okay, these could be the factors. Confirmatory factor analysis, you actually have a good sense of the structure of the data set, and you're testing your hypothesis of that against the structure of your data against your hypothesized structure, and then you see, well, how well does that is the goodness of fit in that purpose. Now, yeah, and this is what this. So what's the difference? EFA explores the data structure, and confirmatory factor analysis confirms the data structure. Confirmatory factor analysis is what's used more commonly these days, but it's a little bit more advanced. The purpose of this lecture and this course is introducing you to exploratory factor analysis, because this is an important first step. And then if you're interested further, you can look into confirmatory factor analysis, and the principles of it allow you to understand this. So you may be still trying to think, if my hand gestures weren't really effective, or thinking about how items load onto factors, here's a nice figure. So hopefully that helps a bit better. So imagine that you had a survey of 8 items, and that survey was measuring happiness, right? And so actually it would be better if I actually used the example that I put in here. So that survey was measuring personality, or some traits of personality. And then you do your factor analysis, and you realize actually 4 of these items, or variables, or questions on the survey, load really nicely onto one factor. They cluster together. So these items load onto like 2 underlying factors, and because the other 4 load onto the other factor. So the items represent or tap or measure what the construction or the factor is. And the factors are made up of relatively similar or related variables or items. So put all the words that are similar to one another, that are used interchangeably, all in this slide. So maybe too convoluted, but hopefully it helps you realize that when I say these words, they're all sort of the same thing. And when you read about them in further reading, you'll know that they're all the same. And so ideally what you're seeing here is, in your head, you're imagining a survey that has 8 items, and then you can see that you've done your analyses, and 4 fit onto one factor and 4 fit on the other. Then you're asking yourself, well, what are these factors? What does it mean for them? And then so you may not know what those factors are. And so you have to look at the items. And so we start looking at what these items mean. We say, oh, okay, so one says talkative and shy and sociable and fun. And the other says anxious, gloomy, relaxed, and tense. And then you start to realize, okay, so what could this first factor be talking about? The first factor maybe is talking about introversion or extroversion. It's a measure of introversion, extroversion. And the second factor may be relating to neuroticism, right? And so that's our sort of simple conceptual model. And then if we talk to others and they agree about how we're defining these factors, then we could say, or we have sufficient justification, then we could say, well, look, here are the factor items that load onto this factor. I think this factor is measuring this construct. And so now I'm going to create a composite score. Now I have a composite score of introversion, extroversion that I could use. And maybe I'm interested in questions like, what is the relationship between introversion, extroversion, and the ability to perform well in statistics, and maybe you see some relationship between those. And so this is the utility of using factors. Now, in reality, models can be simple or complex. And so this is an example of the complexity that occurs, which is a simple model is where every item it loads onto one factor only and you've got your clear structure. A more complex model is where you have cross-loading. So some items, like shyness, actually load onto what you think is introversion, extroversion, and loads onto the neuroticism factor. So there's this relationship between shyness as a variable and both factors. And I didn't draw it here because I didn't want it to be overwhelming, but it could also be even more. You can have even more cross loadings than just the single, right? You can have multiple cross loadings, they're loading onto multiple factors, and your job is really trying to tease apart, well, what are the items that most strongly relate to the factor and represent what I think that factor is. So key questions asked, how many factors are there? So imagine this not as a box of dots, but as many items and within a survey. And so say you have 9 items in the survey and you're asking yourself, well, how many factors are there? Is it that those 9 items cluster onto one factor? Is it that if you actually have 3 factors that are there, so that it may represent 3 constructs, or is it perhaps representing 9 factors? And so to which factor does each item best belong? And so these are really the questions that we need statistics to help us answer, and that's what we'll be doing. So here is an example. What is the underlying factor structure of students' attitudes towards debt? So Harrison, this 2015 paper, they recruited indebted undergraduates to respond to 20 items on debt, and based on exploratory factor analysis using principal components analysis with oblique rotation. You'll be masters in this terminology soon, but just bear with me for now. But this is just what they've done in this study, but we'll cover it in a moment. They identified 4 factors in this study, explaining 45% of the variance. So in the overall variance, 45% of the variance was accounted for by these 4 factors. And the 4 factors were anxiety, utility for lifestyle, utility for investment, and awareness. So anxiety was the negative affect associated with indebtedness. Utility for lifestyle was debt useful for maintaining social life or normative life. Utility for investment was student debt is an investment in career, and awareness was knowledge of debt and requirements for repayment. So here's an example. You can follow up the paper and get a sense of the underlying factor structure that was there and how it was done. So that is that. Hopefully take a break, take it all in, and understand that when you come back for the next part of this lecture, we're going to talk about the steps to conduct an exploratory factor analysis. But hopefully you have a good sense of the ways in which it can be used, the general principles of what it's doing and how it's, the how is coming up very soon, but general principles of what it's doing. So synthesize that, stretch your legs, look at a tree and a bird and come back. Or even if you don't find one, just come back soon. I'll see you guys very soon.